So welcome to our discussion. Ebs, I loved this movie so much. I wanted to start at the beginning though and ask you, how did you get your hands on these tapes that George Plimpton made in preparation for his biography of Capote?
Well, actually, a family friend was super close to George and his widow, Sarah. And it was really, I had, of course, read George's biography and was put in touch with Sarah. And then she and I spent a lot of time on the phone and just kind of back and forth. And then we met up and she said, there are some tapes that George, she said, I still have those tapes somewhere. And they were kind of, at another house of theirs somewhere out in the countryside. And she said, I don't really know if there's anything on them that might be useful. But she was so generous and said, well, here, take these. And, there were boxes of them, of these,
Oh my God.
old cassette tapes that I started, having transcribed, but then also digitized and so forth. And it was just a wonderful gift and a great legacy, certainly, of George.
Yeah, I mean, it's extraordinary. It's extraordinary just to hear George Plimpton's voice because nobody talks like that anymore.
No,
It takes you back to kind of an earlier time in American letters.
it does. And it's so wonderful because on some of the stuff, obviously there were so many hours that didn't end up in the film, but there's some great moments where he's talking to, Slim Keith or Lauren Bacall, and you kind of hear, they're saying, he says, is this thing on? Is it on? And then you hear, one of these women being like, darling, I don't know, fix me a drink. And then you hear like ice clinking, and it's such a wonderful throwback. And yeah, to hear his voice and to, again, this great gift from George.
Yeah. No, they're extraordinary. But in addition to the tapes, you have these amazing talking heads. And I mean, I'm thinking of, just the lineup of people you got, from Jay McInerney to Sally Quinn to Andre Leon Talley, Dick Cavett. Were there any people you wanted to get but wouldn't commit to being in the film?
Let me just think. Were there any people who I really wanted who wouldn't commit? No. I think the saddest thing for me was when I originally started the project, one of the first people who was an old family friend that I went to was Liz Smith, who of course had been a great gossip columnist.
Yeah.
And I sat down with Lizzie, and she was probably 94 at the time. And she really walked me through, having been so close to Truman herself, walked me through a lot of, what happened when and scandal and so forth. And literally by the 3 or 4 months later, by the time I was ready to go back and get Lizzie on tape, she just her health had taken a slide, a turn for the worst, and she just wasn't able to do it. So I think, a lot of the people that I missed or really wanted, it wasn't a lack of interest, but a lot of it was just time not being on my side.
Yeah. Well, the people you got were extraordinary. I couldn't believe how sharp Dick Cavett is and how illuminating he is about his. He's still got those dry one-liners
Totally.
that just knocked me out.
He's dynamic. He's still just actually so cheeky and so much fun and so witty that that was a wonderful afternoon with him.
Yeah. Oh, I bet. I was curious a little bit about, having done this film and having obviously read Capote yourself, where you put Capote, where you put his literary legacy. Because one of the interesting conversations is there's a point in the film where Norman Mailer says he wrote the best sentences of anyone in our generation. But of course, there's also this sense that kind of builds throughout the film and throughout his life that he's sort of frittering some of that talent away on gossip, on drugs, on drinking. And yet, he left us these beautiful books, but he also left this complicated life. What do you think is his legacy?
I think I have so many emotions. I have so many opinions on this because I've thought about it for such a long, hard time. And it's so interesting because some of it I do believe is tied up in in who he was at that particular point in time and what it was to be a gay man and how people were thought of. There's no question that and Mailer is right, he wrote the best sentences and the work still stands up beautifully. I always say to my older sons, one of my youngest older son, my 19-year-old, and I always say to him, you know, In Cold Blood was, the precursor to Law and Order. I mean, there's so much that, the work speaks for itself. I think, but he never really was that recognized for the work, and I think some of that, we touch on it in the film, but some of that was because, yes, he was a bit of this celebrity personality. He was on Johnny Carson. But, if you put that aside, many at least, of our great writers have been alcoholics or drug addicts or had, very complicated, F. Scott Fitzgerald, for goodness sake. I mean, have had these, Norman Mailer, have had these very complex lives. And I think that there was a bit of him not being taken that seriously by the literary establishment. But also, I do believe there was a bit of an undercurrent of, he was openly gay and he wasn't taken as seriously as some of his counterparts. And so it pains me that the work that when he was living, certainly had the celebrity, but I don't think he had the literary clout and respectability that he deserved. And I do believe that it rankled him, especially when he looked around at his contemporaries, but also when he looked at his dear friend Harper Lee, who, one great, fantastic book, all of the accolades in the world. And, it was a very different, I think it was tough for him.
Yeah. Well, at one point in the film, Colm Toybeen says something about the courage, said everyday life back then took courage. And I was curious, as a gay man yourself, how did you relate to Truman's, to his courage, to his outness, at a time when people were closeted? I mean,
Yeah. What was interesting for me was I had never thought of Truman as courageous. Growing up, when we talk about gay icons and people who, went before you, and you think of Harvey Milk, or you think of Truman never sat there for me in that kind of lineup of real heroes. And even it wasn't, honestly, until my really connecting with Kate Harrington, who, of course, Truman was the daughter of one of Truman's last lovers, and Truman basically adopted her at 13, that for me, he became a hero because he clearly wanted a family. This was a person who wanted, his own childhood was so disjointed and really orphaned in many ways, and growing up with this kind of cousins. And he clearly wanted a family in a time when that just wasn't possible. And so, as for me as a gay man, I have 3 wonderful older stepsons, and then we have a 5-month-old daughter. I take for granted, and I think our kids do, certainly the older boys, that we could create the life that we have. And so it was really eye-opening for me. And that's when, it's also the moment I probably started to have a great deal more a softer side of Truman, a softness for him, when I got to see that softer side of him. And I thought, no, this is actually someone who we shouldn't just be talking about for the amazing work, the body of work, certainly that stands on its own. But we really should also be talking about this person as someone who was a trailblazer and did it. And he didn't do it and feel the need to wave a flag about it. He just did it. And it's kind of incredible.
Yeah, his life, I had known some of the details, but not all of them, about how abandoned he was as a child, and how he essentially grew up, feeling probably like an orphan, feeling abandoned by his mother and his father, but really painfully by his mother, who then goes on to commit suicide. I'm curious about how you connect this existential feeling he had, which I think Slim Keith mentions, of being unlovable and unloved, and kind of he's sort of a freak. With what happens to him later with answered prayers, with the fact that he writes this book and is rejected by these women who were, some of whom, his really dearest friends.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a point at which it's almost tragic in the Shakespearean sense that his own flaw has led to his downfall. Um, how do you draw those lines? I think the film does a beautiful job doing it. It's so painful.
It is painful. It is painful, and it's painful, and it's a mix of a lot of different things. It's a mix of, some of it is a mix of, Answer Prayers is in part a product of drugs and alcohol. I mean, we can't, Answer Prayers, he had been working on Answer Prayers for such a long time. So I think by the end there, a lot of that writing, and by the way, people disagree. I still find the book incredibly interesting. I mean, the chapters that exist, incredibly interesting, but it's not his finest writing. Right. But I think a lot of that is, it's slightly sloppy. And painkillers and alcohol, they dull the senses in a way. And I think that's one component of it. And I also think if the writing had been spot on, I don't necessarily think everyone would have had the uproar that they had, because they all knew what he was capable of and they all knew that he was writing the book. But it is it's Shakespearean. It's terribly sad because he created a family amongst these women. Right. He created this family, and then he ripped it apart. And yet, Truman would say, A, I'm a writer, but B, it's also in many ways what he'd done from the beginning. There's a great story about him. I think he was maybe eight or nine. And he wrote a story that won a prize from the town newspaper. And it was called Mrs. Busybody. And it was all about this nosy woman who sat on her porch every day, minding everyone else's business. And of course, that woman was Harper Lee's mother. And it was this terribly not flattering, portrait of this, very nosy neighbor. And of course, he uncovered the secrets of Marlon Brando. This is what Truman did. I mean, Truman wrote about what he saw and what he knew. I mean, when you think about In Cold Blood, the years spent getting intertwined in that community. These aren't just stories for him. Breakfast at Tiffany's, same thing. These aren't just stories that are pure fiction. They come from somewhere. And so yeah. I think it's what he knew how to do. I think he just went too far, and I think he was cloudy. I think his judgment was a bit cloudy.
Yeah, that's interesting. That Mrs. Busybody detail is so on brand. You think about people who have always been themselves, like from the earliest days.
Exactly.
Incredible.
Exactly.
Incredible. There's a point where Dotson Rader, who I think is one of the most fascinating talking heads, a name I sort of hadn't heard in a few years, and who is so astute and so honest. He says, when he's talking about sex clubs, but he's also talking about writing, and he says Truman and I are both voyeurs.
Yes.
And then he said all writers are voyeurs.
Right.
What about filmmakers? Are filmmakers voyeurs? Did you find yourself feeling that you were seeing into this man in ways that were uncomfortable at times?
That's very and thoughtful question. Yes, I mean, I think anytime, if you're writing a book, or if you're doing a film or rehearsing a play, anytime you spend, I spent a lot of time with Truman. I mean, I spent a lot of time with Truman. And so, yes, there were definitely moments where I felt like there were aspects of him that I was really perhaps too close to or digging too deep or, but Mike Nichols, who was a great friend, always used to say, and he, before I ever thought I was going to make a film, Mike was always saying, you're going to do something else creative one day. Just keep your eyes open, keep your eyes open. But he used to say that when he looked back on the movies that he did, and he looked back and he said, I realized that each movie I was making at that particular time was in many ways about something I was going through in my own life.
Oh, interesting.
And so I think there was an element to me, again, perhaps with this concept of impending fatherhood and, gay life and, and children and husbands and spouses and all of that, that I sometimes found myself really entrenched in Truman, and not all of it was happy. There's a lot of sad there.
Yeah.
There's a lot of sad there. And so yeah, I found myself very close to him and very close to the project. And yet when it was over, I was happy to let it go, but also really happy that I'd been there. It was kind of like, kind of Carol Burnett-esque. It's like, I'm so glad we had this time together, but I'm like, thank you for allowing me in, Truman.
Yeah, did you miss him when you were done working with him?
Not immediately. And it's only started to manifest itself, I think, it's like small things. You're at a dinner party, or when we were going to dinner parties, but you're talking to someone, and certain things I feel like, oh, that reminds me of something Truman said, or of something from a book, and I think that was the other thing for me. It was doing the film was really a big part of it. Was my now 19-year-old, who was much younger, I wanted him to be able to watch something and find something or someone interesting in it. I didn't care whether he was interested in Truman, whether he was interested in Bill Paley, Slim, Babe, whatever. But it was excavation for me. It was kind of like going into the graveyard and ideally being able to excavate these stories and these elements of lives and of this life that are still really relevant today. I mean, we can still learn so much from those lives that are in the graveyard. And so I think for me, I felt like I was, excavating, and then I have internalized, and in turn probably, constantly spewing out some sort of a Capote line, or it's kind of like a part of me now. So.
I bet. I think that one of your talking heads, Sadie Stein, said that Answered Prayers was kind of a precursor to reality TV. And I'm thinking, like, I could definitely see Truman hanging out with like the women of a Real Housewives.
Yes.
Do you think that what do you think he would be up to if he were around today?
I think he would be prolific on Twitter.
Yes.
I think he would be prolific on Twitter because it's a platform that's made for him. Short one-liners. He would be just kind of shredding everyone. So I think he'd be fascinated by all of this. And I think he'd still be really, he would be on, the Real Housewives after show with Andy Cohen, or he would definitely be trying to have he'd probably be in a feud with Kanye. He'd be in a feud, he'd be like telling Kim Kardashian she should get a divorce or something. I mean, he would have, I think this all, I think Sadie's 100% right. I think all of this speaks to his character, and it also, in a way that I think we are lacking right now. We don't have that many really clever one-liners. There aren't that many really smart people who are like quickly coming back with, it's all a bit, simpler. And I think if he were around, he would elevate that very short, pithy discourse. And I think we'd be talking about Truman all the time. I'd be like, and Capote recently said.
Right, exactly. Do you think he was ahead of his time as a writer
Yeah.
as well?
Yes. I mean, I think he was ahead of his time as a writer. I think he's one of those people that was just always, I think you hope in life you can be one or two steps ahead. And then I think there's some people who are 5 or 10 steps ahead. And sometimes that doesn't end so well because they're just so far ahead. And again, going back even to that school story of Mrs. Busybody, he was always just so far ahead of everybody else. I think the writing, you know, is still, there's still, Miriam, which is one of my favorite short stories, it's still so beautiful and haunting and, everything. And of course, In Cold Blood, I mean, like I said, we're still watching Law and Order and SVU, and he was really, really far ahead in the writing. He was really far ahead in the way he chose to live and living out loud, and he was ahead of his time. But I think all of that takes a toll and took a toll, and I think I think he dealt with that toll with drugs and alcohol, and therefore that was how he numbed the pain.
Well, I think I have to say thank you for a great conversation. We're running out of time, but this was extraordinary, and the movie is brilliant. And I hope all of our audience out there in Boston Globe land enjoyed watching it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.